I'm getting a lot of this intellectually, and I've realised that I live, breathe, eat, sleep, anger and fear. Apart from a few little aha moments where I think, yep, I've done a tiny, tiny little bit of love. And intellectually I know that the process...
Can I just stop you a bit? So you said you eat, sleep, breathe,
yeah.
anger and fear.
Yeah.
Can I, before you go with your next part, this is a very good state. Because remember you started off...
It doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel good, no, but it is a very good state. Remember you started off believing you had no fear and you had no anger. And now at least you know the truth. And that is, no, anger and fear dictates a lot of my life. That is the truth.
Yeah.
And knowing that truth is very, very powerful, because now you have the ability to change. If you didn't know that truth, you would never change. So you're at the state now where I feel, I talked about the converging points. There was the point of what we believe. That says believe. And then there's the point of what we actually are, what is real or actual. And what's happened is those 2 points now for you have started to converge. This is progress. This is called progress. Now, unfortunately, though, the reason the world itself doesn't view it as progress, you see. So everybody else judges that as a lack of progress. But no, this is progress. This is true progress, because now we've come to terms with what really drives us. And this is wonderful, Vera. You need to see it as wonderful.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. I've worked through it.
You will after you've gone through the emotion of it, yes? So let's proceed with your question.
The thing is, and intellectually I also understand that, I've done some processing.
Yes.
And I know it works.
Yes.
And I've tried to do anger. Mm-hmm. Now, I injure myself every time.
Yes.
And a lot of it's been coming up for me.
Yes.
And I'm sitting in it. And I think, what's stopping you? Why aren't you... I know the process. I know what to do.
It's a very good question, what's stopping you. So let's answer it. Has everyone got that? Can I rub that off? Because we need to do some more diagrams now. Okay. I want to leave that childhood stuff, childlike stuff there if I can. So mistakes, questions, leave that there. Okay. To process any emotion, we need to understand its dynamics. In other words, how it gets created. That makes sense, doesn't it? If we understand how it gets created, then we have a chance to process it. So let's look at all of our emotions and how they get created. During our childhood, grief is a fairly common emotion, actually, because any time that our parents suppress us, we will experience some feelings of not being loved. And any time our parents go into rage or anger or fear, we will feel the feelings of not being loved. Does that make sense? Now, because we feel those feelings of not being loved, every single time there'll be some pain. Because whenever we're not loved, pain is always an associated emotion. So grief is something, and underlying everything is an underlying grief that we weren't loved somehow. That starts everything. But what happens is that we were taught to suppress our grief, usually by being punished. So for most of us, we were punished in some way whenever we experienced grief. So usually we got a belting, or we were told to shut up. There was anger. Often it was a combination of anger and a belting. Whenever a child has a good cry, that's generally the result. So the next layer of emotions that we learn to live through are fear-based emotions. Does that make sense so far? Then what we do is we don't like feeling fear, because fear is a terrible feeling to feel. It's one of the most difficult emotions actually for most people to feel. And so what we do is we enter into addictions in order to avoid the fear. You right with us so far? So now we've got a layer of addictions that are inside of us, and the addictions can be physical. So in other words, they could be drink, smoking, drugs, whatever, right? Sex, whatever. It can be emotional addictions, and emotional addictions are things like, I'll do this for you if you do that for me. You want other people to think want other people to approve of you, to think that you're good, to be accepted, to be cared for. And there's all these addictions. We just have a long list of emotional addictions. We also have some spiritual addictions, actually, many of us. Sometimes we're addicted to not believing in God at all. Sometimes we're addicted to believing in God, but a God of punishment. And therefore, we create a whole lot of religious expectations as a result. So these are all addictions. Now, when any of our addictions do not get met, the initial response is anger. So anger is the layer above our addictions. Yes? So understand that every time you're feeling your anger, it's because you're refusing to feel your addictions. Yeah, no. Keep going. Ask the question.
I get the theory of it.
Yeah,
and
no.
I sit there telling myself, well, I'll watch myself, somebody hasn't met an addiction, I'll get angry. I think, right, your addiction, why this? Now you're feeling angry, go and kick something. So I do my back in. And
are you prepared to feel your addiction? See, these are all feelings, if I can just explain. These are all feelings, yes?
Yeah.
Feelings or emotions. All of these. All right? They're all feelings. To get to the next layer of feelings, you have to be prepared to feel the layer that blocks you. So, if I am in anger, I need to be prepared instead to feel my fear. And this is where you're struggling, because you're not always prepared to feel your fears, to actually feel them.
I felt a lot of them, I think, or am I still doing spirit fears?
Well, no, I feel you. I feel you're starting to get into this process, because the beauty of what you've done up to now is you had what you believed you were like and what was real. So this is the bottom line here, what is really you. And now you've got to the point where you've recognised, wow, I'm just full of fears, and those fears cause me to be angry. Now, understand though, the fears don't cause you to be angry. It's your unwillingness to feel them that causes you to be angry.
So when I'm trying to be angry and I get really tired, or I hurt myself, or do something else, it's because I'm not willing to feel the fear.
Yes, you want the addiction met rather than feeling the fear that the addiction covers, to actually feel it. So most of our addictions are related to feelings of not being loved, not being wanted, not being accepted, not being approved of, and so forth.
You've pretty much covered them.
Yeah. And what we do is we set up our addictions to meet all of those fears. So our addictions are like, if I have an interaction with you, I've got to be, I can't confront you, because if I confront you, you don't feel that's approval, and therefore it's not meeting one of your addictions, and therefore it's triggering a fear, and then you don't like your fear being triggered of not being approved of, and so then you revert to anger. Does that make sense? There's a cycle that goes on there. And if we understand that dynamics, initially we have to understand it with our mind, like you've done. Now the step you're taking is to going into understanding it emotionally. Now that requires you to actually feel the emotion. That's the part that's hard. That's the part that everybody gets stuck on. Everybody. Not just Awira, right? Every single person I've ever known who's ever come across the Divine Love path gets stuck at the point of feeling their fears.
All right, so I want to know what to do about it. Like,
that's also a fear.
Yeah, I'm still looking for my manual.
What does the child do? The child just feels it without the angle, without wanting to understand what it has to feel. The child just goes ahead and feels it, chooses to feel it. And this is one of the constructs that we have as an adult, that we believe we have to understand it before we can feel it. A child doesn't understand it, and yet it feels it and releases it pretty much straight away. So there's a process we need to get back to. So what you're doing is going through a process of releasing this adult way of dealing with problems and getting back to the childlike way, which is actually a very rapid way of dealing with problems. Now, I'm not suggesting that all children are loving, because that is certainly not true. What I am suggesting is the way they handle emotions is the fastest way generally to releasing them, right? Even their unloving ones. Now, I've given you examples of this before where I've seen a child like come up and hit somebody. Like just a few weeks ago, we were staying with a couple, and it was a couple of months ago, probably now, a couple of months ago, wasn't it? Where the child, and I'll give you another example, actually just happened probably 4 weeks ago. We were at a seminar, and this child just ran riot in the seminar, like, you know, distracting everybody. His mother, just sat there doing nothing. Nothing at all, just sat there watching the riot. She was the only person probably who could concentrate because she's so used to the riot that everybody else was always distracted. And then we showed a movie and he was back and forward, yelling through the movie, and, you know, it was very interruptive, the whole process. So the child obviously not being very loving, right? So I went to talk with both her and him after the seminar, and she asked me, how do I handle, like, she recognised that the child's behaviour was unloving. She could also see her own behaviour was unloving because she didn't take the child out while it was being such a disturbing so many people. So she could see her own behaviour was unloving, so I talked to her about that. And then she asked me the question, how would you deal with the child? I said, it's very simple. And I got the little lad, and all I did was squatted down like this and just held him to my body and didn't allow him to move. How many seconds do you think it took before he was screaming? It took about 2 seconds, and he was screaming. And then while he was screaming, I was talking to his mum. I was saying, see, your child does not like being restricted. He doesn't even like being restricted in a loving manner. Right? He doesn't like being told that he can't do something. He doesn't like being, he likes being unloving. I said, now watch what happens. I let him go. He went up and punched his mother as hard as he could in the leg as soon as I let him go. And she watched that occur and did nothing. Did nothing. And so I firstly addressed that she did nothing. And then I grabbed him again and held him again and said to him, you can't punch your mother anytime. And I'm going to hold you here until you stop screaming about it. Because he wanted to go up and punch her again. So I just held him. It was outside of a public place, and she became so embarrassed because I held him for about 5 minutes only. Everybody inside the hall heard him because he was just screaming his lungs out. And if it was me, I would have just stayed holding him until he began to cry, properly cry, like grieving cry. Because what he had to do is he had to go through his addiction not getting met. And when you go through your addiction not getting met, you revert to anger, and then you drop down into your fear, and then you'll get eventually to your grief as a feeling. Now, I've done that with other children, and it's taken 1.5 to 2.5 hours generally of holding them, which requires a lot of love on your part, right, to do that without feeling bad and without feeling guilty and eventually they've dropped into their grief, and after they've dropped into that grief, they never do the same thing again, ever, right? Never do it again. Unless the parent reinfects them with the same emotion. Right? They'll never do it again. Now, most parents are unwilling to do that with their child, and you know why? Because they're unwilling to do it with themselves. Right? What do I mean by that? Most of us have all of these addictions in play in our life, and we're totally unwilling to accept them not being met. Totally unwilling. We want every single addiction in our entire life to be met. That's our problem, right? And we think we should be able to get away with that, and we can't. We're not going to be able to get away with that. If we want to become loving, we're not going to be able to get away with that. Because a lot of our addictions are unloving, both to ourselves and to other people. So what we're going to need to do is confront our addictions. When we confront them, we will feel anger. You will feel anger. Initially, when you first confront them, you'll feel like anger is the only thing you ever felt, is the feeling that you feel. You go through this period of anger which it can last weeks or months, and I've seen it last years for some people, where they've been just angry, and then recognising they're angry and seeing that the addiction's not getting met. If you're willing, if you have a willingness to face your fear, you will be a lot less angry if you have a willingness to face your fear. But a lot of people have very little willingness initially to face their fears.
So what you're saying is I'm making the choice not to feel my fear.
Yes.
So
it's a choice. Spot on. It's a very good intellectual realisation to have.
yeah,
The key is to translate that now into an emotional realisation of, wow, if I choose to feel my fear, then I'll never get angry again. That's a pretty amazing thing when you think about it, isn't it? That if I actually choose to feel all of my
How do I make
fears.
that choice emotionally? Intellectually, I've made the choice. Emotionally, clearly don't want to do it.
Yes, and that's the case for most people. And so what you need to do is look at the addictions and why you want them fulfilled. So Mary, you want to comment? Mary's going through this same process of error, so it would be good for her to comment about.
Yeah, I feel there's a space where you feel the addiction. It's like, initially it feels like whenever the addiction isn't met, I'm in anger. Automatically, my soul is just still so decidedly avoiding the fear that I just jump straight to anger. But it feels like there's a space where I can feel my addiction, emotionally feel what is going on.
If you could liken it to like a person who's giving up smoking and they badly want to go and buy another pack, that feeling that they have. Or a person who's giving up drugs, or a person who's giving up drinking and they badly want the drink. And they're pounding around the house, looking for the cupboard that's got the spare bottle, or they're pounding around the house looking through the rubbish to find the butt that's half smoked, Now, in that space, that's what we're like emotionally. We're the same as that emotionally. We're pounding around trying to get what we've got to do is be observant enough to see, what am I doing? I'm looking through a rubbish bin for a cigarette. What am I doing to myself here? You've got to see that place and decide to not take the addictive action and instead feel what you're afraid of instead of taking the addictive action. Yeah. And that takes a lot of self-observation to do that.
Yeah, and it feels emotional too. I've done that intellectually and prevented a lot of my addictions, but my soul's still driving things. So it feels like there's an emotional place I get to where emotionally I feel like, I really want this emotion from someone. I really want this thing. And it's like an emotional realisation that that's not loving or something. And then my fear kind of
starts to feel, yeah. Because a lot of times when we're getting the addiction met, we notice it, we go, wow, I'm doing that. There's this point of recognition generally where we go, wow, look what I've just done with my son, my daughter, my mother, my father, my wife, my husband, whatever it is, who's close to us, my workmate, my friend or whatever. Look what I just did. That was just totally driven by the fact that I want to avoid a fear. And when they didn't give me what I wanted back, I just feel angry with them straight away. That tells me I'm still wanting my addiction met, right? So what I do is I acknowledge that, right? I need to acknowledge that I want this addiction met. once I've acknowledged that I want the addiction met, now I have the opportunity to examine the fear that's underneath it. Now, firstly, intellectually, I'll examine the fear, but remember, that was only one half of the equation. We've got to get to the other half of the equation, which is emotionally feeling the fear. That's when most people go like that, right? And they throw their hands up and everything else that are in their hands in the air, and they want to give up, right? They want to throw in the towel, as the saying goes, right? We've got to get beyond that point and into the point of actually feeling the emotion. Once you feel the emotion, you'll be surprised at how rapidly you can work your way through the emotion. But it will feel distressing, because every error-based emotion is distressing to feel and release. Because you feel like you're giving up something that's a part of you. And it is a part of you. It's been a part of you for how long have you been alive now? We're like 50 years? So it's been a part of you for 50 years. A lot of these emotions have been, a lot of these emotions were created within the first 7 years of your existence, and the rest of the time we've been living in them. And of course, after 43 years of living in them, it's going to be like, they're going to feel like they are just a part of our very nature. And when we give them up, it feels like a part of us is getting torn out of us. And it's going to feel painful. But once it's gone, now we will never, ever, ever even have the emotion to respond to inside of us. So anger cannot come up because the fear is gone and we've dealt with the grief on that particular issue. So the anger on that particular issue just does not arise anymore. Right? So there are issues that years ago I used to get very angry about, and now no anger at all comes up in the same situation, right? And the reason why is once you've dealt with the emotion and released the emotion, it's like there's no need for anger anymore because there's no addiction anymore involved in the process. You're not feeling an addiction anymore that you badly want to get fulfilled. So the key is to be patient with yourself, right? Which is something that your parents told you not to be, right? And you need to be patient with this process. So yes, you've spent a lot of time learning about the psychology of it, shall I call it, the intellectual part of it. Now you're actually putting it into practice. Putting it into practice is much more difficult than learning about it intellectually, right? But the reality is that until you put it into practice, you won't really understand it either. So that's also a reality. Yeah. Now, what we do with these, and perhaps what we need to do is have a break in a second, so I can feel everyone needs to have a break. So what we do with this, we need to discuss in terms of how this affects the other part. We need to put the two things together now of what we've discussed with this particular flow of emotion and compare it with those two columns that we created earlier about what we do with our intellect in terms of determining truth and what we do with our emotions in terms of determining truth, and come up with some practical examples and situations where we can reflect upon what would we do in these practical examples. Now, the problem with any practical example is that every one of them is individual in nature, and so therefore cannot be applied right across the board to every single thing. So please remember that when we come up with these practical examples. Go back to the underlying theory, if you like, which is the two columns, the intellectual side, those 3 points that we raised on the intellectual side, the 3 points we raised on the emotional side. This is the general level of emotion that's in us. Almost every emotion that we've got that's out of harmony with love can be fit into one of these areas of emotions, right? And so all we need to do is understand the relationship between these types of emotions, what's going on in our intellect and what's going on in our emotional self, and we'll have a great way of determining the truth of our life, but not only the truth of our life, but also the truth about the universe in the process. Yep. So let's have a break now. Shall we have a break till